Trigger warning for this episode. This episode contains sensitive content and discussions about sexual predators and related sensitive topics that may not be appropriate for all listeners. While we approach this conversation with care and respect, the content may be distressing for some. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know has been affected by sexual abuse, please consider seeking support from a trusted professional or resource.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Behind the Veil, where we pull back the curtain on the LDS Church and expose things that they won't teach you in Sunday school.
Before we get started, I want to briefly introduce you to our faith transition coaching program. Untangling yourself from Mormonism or any high-demand religion can feel isolating and overwhelming at times. And I want to help you navigate this journey with compassion, support, and the tools you need to move forward with confidence. There is no agenda. This is your path. So whether you find peace in Christianity, Buddhism, atheism, or something entirely your own, I'm just here to guide you in discovering what resonates with you. But just know you don't have to go through this alone. Click the link below for more information.
We'll begin with the polygamous exploitation inflicted by Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. And you may have heard about a lot of these stories, but hold on to your hats and keep watching, because you haven't seen anything yet. For over 80 years, elite Mormon leaders married underage girls, teenagers, sister pairs, and much more. So stay tuned for the scandalous behavior of those that LDS members believe are prophets and apostles of God, when in reality they would be more fittingly called predators. And most of these marriages can be found on FamilySearch for you to check for yourself. And if any of these marriages are not found on FamilySearch, we will be posting all of our sources on our website. You can find that link in the description. And we believe every person who comes into contact with the LDS Church, whether that's current members, potential converts, former members, or even just the general public, everyone deserves to know the truth. The early Mormon Church was not built on divine revelation. It was built on systematic coercion, exploitation, and control through eternal polygamy as a requirement for salvation. The reality of the over 80-year reign of Mormon polygamy is so dark and so disturbing, and so riddled with coercion and abuse that it's almost beyond comprehension. And yet, this was the foundation of a church that still claims to be God's one true church on earth. The stories we will share are gut-wrenching, infuriating, and difficult to hear, but they must be heard. The Mormon Church has carefully erased, rewritten, and sanitized its own history, leaving members in the outside world unaware of the real horror that women and young girls endured for the sake of this so-called celestial order. We won't spend too much time exposing Joseph Smith and Brigham Young's well-documented predatory behavior. That work has already been done by so many exposés of the church, including several of our own videos. You can find all those links down below in the description. However, it is crucial to recognize that Joseph Smith's model of abuse became the standard for every LDS prophet and apostle who followed him. And before we dive into the abusive and predatory marriage practices of LDS prophets and apostles, we must first shatter the myth that this was in any way normal for the time. Apologists love to argue that we can't judge the past by today's moral standards, but this defense falls apart under the smallest amount of historical scrutiny. The truth is that moral standards in the 19th century were actually higher than they are today, not lower. The majority of Americans at the time were not engaging in the forced marriage of teenage girls to middle-aged or old men, nor were they practicing a system where women were coerced into polyandrous or polygamous relationships under the threat of eternal damnation. These were not the norms of the broader society. They were the unnatural, calculated practices of an isolated religious hierarchy bent on securing power through the control of women and bloodlines. To prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt, let's start with the US Census data on the median age of first marriage in 1890. So according to these official records, the median age of marriage for women in the United States was around 22 years old, while for men, it was closer to 26. This means that the vast majority of women were not getting married as teenagers, and those who were married in their teenage years were getting married to men within 5 years of their own age.
It was not normal for a teenage girl to marry a man in his 30s, 40s, 50s, or even 60s, as was commonly done in the Mormon church during the 1800s. In mid-19th century America, marriage practices typically involved individuals marrying partners close to their own age. Data from 1850 indicates that the mean age at first marriage was approximately 26.6 for men and 22.9 years old for women, so almost 23 years old, suggesting that both men and women entered into marriage as young adults rather than during adolescence. Large age disparities between spouses were relatively uncommon and often viewed with societal disapproval, such as the common 19th century term May-December marriages, where there was a significant age difference between partners. They had this little term that they had coined for this because it wasn't considered normal. These marriages were believed to lead to discord and unhappiness, as contemporaneous literature and societal norms favored unions between individuals of similar ages. This just makes sense. So most of this apologetic garbage is not founded in any factual evidence, information from that time period, the morals and values of that time period. They were a lot more strict about their morals and values back then. So it just doesn't make any sense what these apologists are trying to claim other than just trying to cling on to their beliefs. So how did the rest of the world feel about the marriage practices among the early Mormon church? Despite apologists trying to claim that early Mormon marriage practices should not be subject to our modern ideas of morality, this is a laughable concept considering that moral standards were far higher. In fact, as evidence, adultery was illegal and punishable by fines or imprisonment. So their moral standards were certainly not lower than what they are today, because adultery is not illegal and you are not punished by being imprisoned for it. This is simply a way to try to distract from the despicable behavior of Mormon prophets and apostles. And I want to just point out here, it wasn't just Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. It was pretty much all of them for over 80 years that were doing this stuff. Not just polygamy, but marrying underage girls, sisters, and all of the behavior just like Joseph Smith. They're just using this to justify their behavior, claiming it was just normal, when it was anything but normal for their time. And I want to give just one example of how the world viewed Mormon marriage practices back then. And this comes from the Daily Union Vidette, and it was published in Sacramento City, California on September 23rd, 1865. And it says, in the first place, old men of 70 marry young girls at 14 years of age, and in some instances, they give the parents of the child a cow or an old gun or some other trifling thing. In the next place, a man will marry a girl, and that girl's brother will marry her husband's daughter, and very frequently a man marries 2 or 3 sisters. But worst of all, many go so far as to marry a woman and her daughter or daughters, as the case may be. Again, the missionaries from there to the old countries urged the immigration, especially that of the females. And many women have, when they have not had sufficient means to immigrate with their whole family, immigrated with their daughters and left their husbands and the rest of the family to follow them the next year or as soon after as they can procure the means. So this is what we intend to expose today. If you were listening to that, there's a man who would marry a woman and her daughters. This stuff was happening all over the place. And we want to expose that early Mormon prophets and apostles and even the general membership of the church engaged in predatory behavior towards young girls.
And so let's go ahead and start with Joseph Smith. So according to LDS historians and scholars, Joseph Smith had anywhere between 34 and 45 wives. Most commonly, people say it was 34, but if you dive really deep into the records, there is some evidence of up to 45 wives, and many of whom were not well documented because polygamy was illegal at the time, so his marriages were secretly performed. Even his own wife Emma was unaware of the first 20 marriages. So according to the FamilySearch records, Joseph Smith married 7 underage girls. And first off, I'd like to thank Mormon Infographics for this wonderful layout of the wives of Joseph Smith. We've also created some of our own for the other prophets and apostles. You can check those out on our Patreon. But back to Joseph Smith's underage girls. First, he married Sarah Whitney and Sarah Lawrence, who were only 17 years old. Then we have Fanny Alger, Flora Woodworth, and Lucy Walker, who were 16 years old. Nancy Winchester was 15, and the youngest, Helen Mar Kimball, was only 14 years old when she was married to Joseph Smith. And I know the whole apologist thing, oh, she was almost 15, so close to her 15th birthday. That doesn't make it better. She is still a very young child. And for those who claim that he did not have any sexual relationships with any of these underage girls, there was testimony given in depositions for the Temple Lot case that prove otherwise. And we've covered all of this in a previous episode, so we're not going to be presenting all of that here. But again, we've already covered it, so check out the links in the description for our other videos where we do go into detail about that. And our purpose for this episode is to show that all of the prophets, or at least most of the prophets and apostles through the first 100 years of the church, were predators. It wasn't just Joseph Smith. It wasn't just Brigham Young. It was almost everybody. And Joseph Smith also married 3 sets of sisters. We got Sarah and Mariah Lawrence, Emily and Eliza Partridge, and Zena and Priscilla Huntington. He also married a mother-daughter pair with Patty and Sylvia Sessions. And he married 11 women in polyandrous marriages. And I want to go over a few quotes to help you understand the reality that these young women faced when they entered into these false marriages. And you may think that these were merely dynastic sealings that the church apologists love to always say that they were. Oh, it's dynastic sealing, that's it, nothing to worry about. But let's see how Joseph Smith actually approached these predatory so-called marriages. So to give a little backstory, Lucy Walker's mother had recently passed away, and Joseph Smith had told her father that if he did not go on a mission and get some fresh air, he would follow his wife in death. And Joseph assured Lucy's father that he would make sure his children were taken care of while he was gone.
Yeah, this is just such an abusive thing that he did. But I want to point out really quickly, if you check in one of our other episodes, we go over how Joseph Smith was never even sealed to his own children in his lifetime. So why is he being sealed to other people's children when he wasn't sealed to his own? If you want to call it a dynastic sealing, he at least needs to be sealed to his own parents and his own children before he starts going around being sealed to other people's children. Otherwise, your argument falls completely flat, in my opinion. So let's keep going on with Lucy Walker's story. And this is from In Sacred Loneliness by Todd Compton on pages 462 and 464. And it says, thus Joseph Smith had sent John Walker, the father, on a long mission while the family was still grieving for the mother. He had split up the siblings, separating the younger children from the older, and referred to the older Walkers as his own children. At this point, Smith proposed to 15 or 16-year-old Lucy, demanding that she marry him. In her autobiography, she wrote, in the year 1842, President Joseph Smith sought an interview with me and said, I have a message for you. I have been commanded of God to take another wife, and you are the woman. Then this is how Lucy felt about this. My astonishment knew no bounds. This announcement was indeed a thunderbolt to me. He next emphasized his authority as a prophet of God. He asked me if I believed him to be a prophet of God. Most assuredly I do, I replied. He fully explained to me the principle of plural or celestial marriage, said this principle was again to be restored for the benefit of the human family, that it would prove an everlasting blessing to my father's house. Lucy was horrified by the proposal and wrote in her own autobiography that she was suicidal. She said, quote, tempted and tortured beyond endurance until life was not desirable. Oh, that the grave would kindly receive me, that I might find rest on the bosom of my dear mother. Why should I be chosen from among thy daughter, Father? I am only a child in years and experience, no mother to counsel, no father near to tell me what to do in this trying out. Oh, let this bitter cup pass, and thus I prayed in the agony of my soul. Who would do such a thing to a 16-year-old girl who had just lost her mother, had been separated from half of her siblings, and her father sent on a mission? I will tell you, a prophet of God does not behave in this way towards underage girls that he has guardianship over. He's calling these Walker children his children. He has guardianship over them because their parents are gone. And then he proposes marriage to a 16-year-old girl who is in the agony of her soul, wishing that she could die and be with her mother. There are many other stories of the underage brides of Joseph Smith, and they follow the exact same pattern. Not only the proposal, but also the agony and the suffering that the mental and emotional torment that these young girls go through. We're not going to detail that in this episode, but we have in previous ones if you want to see that. But we're going to end with just her story. We just wanted to show how this pattern began with Joseph Smith. And now we're going to move on to Brigham Young, who was way worse than Joseph Smith in his implementation of this abusive system of predation of women guised as religious marriage. But I want to say, stay tuned, because I know a lot of you have heard about Brigham Young, but you probably didn't know that the vast majority of the prophets to follow him, the apostles that were with him and also following him, all of them were also doing this exact same thing.
They absolutely were. So Brigham Young, he married 5 underage girls. We got Clarissa Decker, who's only 15 years old. We got Ellen Rockwood, Lucy Bigelow, and Elizabeth Fairchild, who were all 16 years old. And Diana Chase, who was 17 years old. And he married all these girls in his early 40s. I'm sorry, that is a massive age gap. And no man in his 40s should be marrying a 15-year-old girl. Honestly, girls that young shouldn't even be close to getting married. And
he was old enough to be their dad.
Absolutely, which is disgusting. And he actually did have children with many of these women. So there were sexual relationships. And some of these girls did end up divorcing him, so they didn't end up having children with him. And Brigham Young also engaged in polyandry, and he was married to 11 women with currently living husbands. He also married 7 of Joseph Smith's wives. The sad reality of this is that the women did not go out and find a husband who loved them and who they loved. They were simply trafficked from one church leader to another, and we'll see more of that here in just a second. And again, we're not going to go into too much detail about Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. Check out the other episodes, because again, it's common knowledge that these men were polygamists, and their exploitive behavior is more well known. What most people don't know is that this behavior of marrying underage girls, sister pairs, all of this was behavior of nearly all of the early prophets and apostles. And another thing a lot of apologists say is, oh, they're just marrying widows and we can provide for them and help them out. But no, this is one of the most laughable excuses that apologists give, as if these men were some type of saint for these poor widows. No, these women were trafficked from man to man. And we actually did a whole episode of trafficking in the Mormon church, so go check that one out. So let's begin with one of the earliest apostles of Joseph Smith. So Oliver Cowdery, he was not a polygamist, but he was excommunicated for calling out Joseph Smith's adulterous affair with 16-year-old Fanny Alger. And then we have Sidney Rigdon, and there was a fallout between Rigdon and Joseph Smith when he found out that Joseph Smith proposed to his teenage daughter. And Rigdon was not a supporter of polygamy, and actually ended up starting up his own spin-off of the church called the Rigdonites, and they were out in Pennsylvania. Then we've got Frederick G. Williams, which was not a documented polygamist, but his wife did end up marrying Heber C. Kimball as well. And Hiram Smith, he was a polygamist, which most members are not aware of. He did have 4 wives. Well, none of them were underage at the time, so we're not going to come for them here. So let's move on to the lesser known but extremely abusive polygamist, Heber C. Kimball. I guess he was well known, but his polygamy and abusive practices are not as well known.
They're not. I knew about Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and honestly, I did not know about Heber C. Kimball. And this man was like, I don't know. I think he could get the world in the Guinness Book of World Records for being the most perverted, disgusting human that ever walked the face of the planet. And I will stand behind what I say. Okay, so before we get into the wives of Heber C. Kimball and dive into all of his despicable behavior, we're going to highlight a few comments that he made about polygamy and women, because I want you to understand why he is in fact a misogynist and an actual predator. So on April 17th, 1860, the New York Times published an article called Polygamy and Its Fruits. And it says, some time ago, Heber Kimball was lecturing some missionaries who were preparing to start out on foreign missions. And this was in the tabernacle. And he said to them, "Brethren, I want you to understand that it is not to be as it has been heretofore. The brother missionaries have been in the habit of picking out the prettiest women for themselves before they get here and bringing on the ugly ones for us. Hereafter, you have to bring them all here before taking any of them, and let us all have a fair shake." The old reprobate then had at least a score of women whom he called wives. This is, I think, an absolute perfect highlight for how Heber C. Kimball saw women. And also, this highlights the level of trafficking that was happening from European countries into Utah Mormon polygamy. And that is exactly how they saw it. Then we have another quote from him. "It is the duty of a woman to be obedient to her husband. And unless she is, I would not give a damn for all her queenly right and authority." This is in the Journal of Discourses, by the way. So let's move on to another statement. "Plurality of wives is a law established by God forever. It would be easier for the United States to build a tower to remove the sun as to remove polygamy." And this was in the Millennial Star, volume 28, page 190. Another quote of his, "I think no more of taking another wife than I do of buying a cow. And if you want to build up the kingdom, you must take more wives." So hopefully this helps drive home the reality that these men were brutes. They were savages who treated women like collector's items for their own will and pleasure. So now let's move on to Heber C. Kimball, because he was every bit a savage brute. He had 43 wives. We're not going to discuss all 43 of them because our focus today is on underage girls. And I did include, in some of these cases, 19-year-old girls or 18-year-old girls, which may not have been considered underage per se. They were still teenagers, though. And in a lot of cases, these girls that were 18 or 19 years old, which technically would be considered adults, these men were in their 40s and 50s, which is also extremely predatory behavior. So any woman that was under the age of 20, I did not include, I included. Any over the age of 20, I did not, but some of them I did include if there was a larger age gap. Heber C. Kimball married 10 teenage girls. But he's marrying these teenage girls beginning when he was in his 40s. So he was old enough to be their father by the time he started doing this. The other twisted aspect of this tale is that he married several of Joseph Smith's wives. So these wives of Joseph Smith were underage when Joseph Smith married them. They were still teenagers when Heber C. Kimball married them. So these girls were not allowed to go out and find husbands that were close to their age, find love, get married. They were trafficked from one prophet to another, which he was probably an apostle at the time, became a prophet later on. It's very clear that these young girls were merely trafficked among leaders of the church, which is very common, as we will show. They were clearly not released from the ravages of being married to much older men in polygamous marriages and not allowed to go out and find a husband on their own. They were merely trafficked to the next leader, and this happened multiple times, as we'll show later on. There's nothing normal about this behavior, whether from the perspective of the people living in the 1800s or today. Nobody in any of that time period would have considered this normal behavior. This was abusive treatment of teenage girls, no matter what time period you lived in.
Absolutely. All this is just absolutely despicable. I'm sorry, I don't want to follow any prophets or apostles who engage in this type of behavior. So let's take a look at some of these very young girls who he married. So we have a bunch of girls here. They're 16, 17, 18 years old. Looks like we got a couple 19-year-olds here. But he's in his 40s when he's marrying these girls. And also, if you take a look at these, we got Nancy Winchester and Sarah Lawrence, who were some of Joseph Smith's underage brides. Or we have Lucy Walker and Sarah Ann Whitney, who are not only married to Joseph Smith, but also married to Heber C. Kimball, which kind of reinforces the fact that these women were passed around from prophet to apostle to whatever. They're passed around between church leaders. These are not normal marriages. These are not just, oh, we're taking care of the widows and the women. Yet, no. This is
well, look at Nancy Winchester. She's married to Joseph Smith at 15 years old. He dies. 4 months later, at 16, she's married to Heber C. Kimball.
Absolutely.
She's a widow at 15 years old and married to another old crotchety 43-year-old guy 4 months later. There is nothing normal about this.
Absolutely.
It's sickening.
And I'm sorry, if you're wanting to take care of the women, why are you marrying 14, 15, 16-year-old girls? You're not taking care of them when you're marrying these young girls. It's ridiculous. And also, Sarah Lawrence, like we said about Nancy Winchester, he also married her 4 months after Joseph Smith's death. And again, basically all of this is all on FamilySearch. You can look this up yourself. It's out there. I'm sure the church may eventually try to hide it, but as of this moment, it's all there. There is absolutely no excuse for any of this. There is absolutely no reason for a man in his 40s who was actually already married to marry himself to 10 teenage girls. And regardless of the time or age or whatever when he was born, LDS members justify this behavior as being divine revelation from God. But this claim is nothing short of taking the Lord's name in vain by placing God's name on your own personal behavior. Be like, oh, you know, it's fine. I'm marrying 15, 14-year-old girls. God's letting me do this. It's totally God. It's ridiculous. And let's move on, because it's not only isolated to these three. Let's move on and show how pervasive this was. So let's move on to Willard Richards.
Yeah, so this was something to be honest with you, I was not aware that all the prophets and apostles were doing this. I knew Joseph Smith did it. I knew Brigham Young did it. When I left the church, I was like, okay, you know, I saw some of the abusive behavior. I had no idea these apostles are marrying underage girls. But don't worry, because it gets even more twisted than Heber C. Kimball, if that's possible. Because Willard Richards not only married teenage girls, he married teenage sisters. So as we go through, Sarah Longstreth was 16 years old when he married her. He was 38. So she's half his age, well, even less than that. But he also married her 18-year-old sister. So he married 16 and 18-year-old girls. And her sister was Nancy Lynn Longstreth. She was 18. He married her later. So he was 42 when he married her sister. We also have Amelia Pearson, who was 18, Mary Thompson, who was 18. Again, you will notice you have a 40-year-old man who is marrying a 16-year-old girl, and then years later marrying her 18-year-old sister. These are the details that apologists in the LDS Church do not want you to know about, what these so-called prophets and apostles of God were doing with teenage girls. There is no excuse. I am sorry. If you are trying to make excuses for 40-year-old men marrying 16-year-old girls and trying to put God's name on it, I don't even know how you can sleep at night with yourself. If you even want to try to justify this type of predatory behavior, it's unimaginable to me to claim that this was of God. No wonder people don't want to believe in God anymore, because look at what you claim God does. As we begin to detail what these men were doing in the 1840s, it becomes blatantly obvious why Joseph Smith had oaths that had to be made in the temple endowment that you would agree to have your throat slit from ear to ear and your bowels cut out if you revealed anything from the temple. Because this wasn't just about the illegal polygamy. This was about old men marrying teenage girls and sister pairs and all kinds of twisted stuff that was going on. They don't want anyone telling the outside world what these people are doing. And I want to emphasize that this was not an isolated thing that's happening among a few people. That would be bad enough if it was. You can't claim to be a prophet and be doing this with teenage girls. I'm sorry, you can't. But this was pervasive, not only among the leadership of the church, but among the general membership of the church for nearly 80 years. And if you're interested in finding more stories, we do have the Anti-Polygamy Sentinel that it will be available in our Patreon, where you can read some of the most horrific stories that they were detailing. And that was a publication that was published from Utah. It was a group of women that wanted to abolish polygamy because they were seeing the suffering of the women in Utah. So if you want that, check out our Patreon. Our next predator had quite the affinity for very young teenage girls, and that would be Jedediah M. Grant. He was the second counselor in the first presidency.
So Jedediah married 4 teenage girls, and it's important to understand how young these girls were. Mormon polygamy turned decent men into the most vile predators who had lost all compassion, feeling, or empathy towards others, and simply had an insatiable need to satisfy their lust. Here we've got Susan Fairchild. She was 16 years old, marrying him when he was 32. Rosetta Robinson was 15. Sarah Thurston, 18. Mariah Kelser, 16 years old, and he's in his, like these last two, he's in his late 30s when he's marrying them. I simply can't understand, like we've said before, how anyone could justify this behavior in any way, shape, or form. And let's head back to the Daily Union Vidette to show that no one in society at the time, outside of Mormonism, thought this behavior was unacceptable. Like, if you weren't in the church, you were disgusted by what these men were doing. And it's not just our modern morals that balk at this behavior. It was considered every bit as despicable in the 1800s, as we'll show here. So, again, the Daily Union Vidette, Sacramento City in California, September 23rd, 1865. It says, "For I can assure you that they are old men with one foot in the grave and the other out crawling around after women. And should they see one that they think they would like, they tell the poor woman that her husband can't save her, and to get a man higher in the priesthood than her husband. And these old cripples often succeed in getting her away. It is the first order of their kingdom of God. Mr. W., I can assure you that there is not that happy smile there upon a woman's countenance which characterizes an English woman. Many of them, as soon as they get here, begin to peep through the wool that has been drawn over their eyes, probably for years, and some of them come out and say Mormonism in Utah and Mormonism in England has no comparison. I found it so long before I got to Salt Lake, but I would like to have found it out before I left my home."
Yeah, I think it's really heartbreaking, because this is another one of those things where, and we've detailed this in many, many, many videos, these women were trafficked. They did not know there was polygamy in Utah. They did not even know that was a thing. And then they get here and it's like, this is required for your salvation. How are they going to get out? They're in the middle of nowhere. The trek west was dangerous. These women wouldn't have had money or anything to get out. And here they say, I wish I had known about this before I left my home. So was this normal behavior? This behavior was absolutely not considered morally acceptable in the 1800s. It was vehemently condemned by everyone outside of Mormonism that knew about it. No decent human being would try to justify this, and yet Mormons will, and they still try to do it today. They look upon the FLDS people with disdain, and yet their own prophets and apostles engaged in the exact same behavior. When they look at Warren Jeffs of the FLDS, who is in prison, who is marrying teenage girls, they think he's sick, he's disgusting, he's perverted. And yet their own prophets and apostles engaged in the exact same behavior as the FLDS for close to 100 years. They come from the exact same prophet, Joseph Smith, who engaged in marrying underage girls and was hiding it from his own wife. The list of prophets and apostles who engaged in marrying teenage girls is long and exhausting. And it was quite frankly shocking for me to go through all of this because I didn't know this until I started going through it. This fact alone, if I had known this at any point in time when I was a member, this would have been all the evidence I needed to know that this church could not possibly be true. And it certainly was not led by men who spoke to God. So our next LDS apostle and predator is Daniel H. Wells, who was also a second counselor in the first presidency. Let's see. So the first wife, Eliza Robison, she was 17, he was 23. Now, I want to point this out. She was his first wife and his legal wife. But what I want to point out here is that we do have a girl who was under 18. But how old was he? He was 23. So they were very close in age when they were married. But I also point this out because she refused to go to Salt Lake with him because of her hatred of polygamy. And she later divorced him and left the church. And I think that this is the reason I bring this up, is because she was a young girl when she was married. She probably was in love with him. And once polygamy came up, she was like, I'm not going with you to Salt Lake. This is it. And I have a lot of respect for her for doing that. So then we move on to Martha Harris, who was 17. But at this point, he was 35. Now, a lot of times, they probably didn't have sex with him, whatever. He had 7 children with her. Then we have 2 sisters. And the reason I point them out, they were 22 and 24. He was 38, so he was a lot older than them, but they were sisters. Lydia had 6 children with him. Susan had 4. So we have sisters that are having children with the same man. This is certainly an unsavory marriage arrangement by any standard. 2 sisters marrying the same man and having children with him. Then we have Hannah and Louisa Free. They were both sisters as well. They were not underage, but again, he marries 2 pairs of sisters and has children. Hannah had 12 children with him, and Louisa had 11 children with him. So they were, again, in their early 20s, and he was in his mid to late 30s. So again, he's much older than these women, and he's marrying sisters. So it's not just multiple women. It's not just that he's living in polygamy, but he's marrying 2 pairs of sisters, which is deeply unsettling. Even in people's ideas of polygamy, I don't think they realize how common it was for people to marry sisters and mother-daughter pairs and all of this stuff. This was far from normal in the 19th century. Plural marriage itself was controversial and legally dubious in its own right. So polygamy in the United States was illegal. They were outside of the United States in the Utah Territory, and that's how they were getting away with it, because they were kind of beyond the reach of a lot of the U.S. government. But taking 2 sisters from the same family and repeating that pattern with yet another set of siblings defies any reasonable social, moral, or even religious justification.
Yeah, this level of familial entanglement that was so common among Mormon polygamists raises serious questions about coercion, family pressure, and the ability of these women to truly consent to such arrangements. The fact that Wells, like many of his peers, used his standing in the church and promises of higher eternal standing in the celestial kingdom to secure multiple women, including full-blooded sisters as wives, is a glaring example of how Mormon polygamy blurred the lines between so-called divine revelation and outright patriarchal domination. So now let's move on over to John Taylor, who at the time was apostle and then later became a prophet. John Taylor began his polygamous harem while he was an apostle of the church, and he had a total of 16 wives, and he was no stranger to the unsavory practice of marrying sisters. His first wife was 37 at the time of their marriage, and he was 25, which is a rare situation among the patriarchal LDS leaders. Despite his much older legal wife, he later turned his sights on teenage girls, beginning with Mary Ann Oakley. And while these girls were not technically underage, just the fact that there's this massive age difference does introduce a very disturbing element to this ever expanding tale of polygamy among early Mormon prophets and apostles. So Mary Ann Oakley, she was 19 and he was 37. Mary Ramsbottom was 19 and he was 38. And if the much younger teenage girls doesn't trigger the ick factor for you, he also married sister pairs. He married Annie and Jane Ballantyne, who were 28 and 31. And they were sisters from Scotland, where John Taylor served his mission. According to a document attached to Jane's FamilySearch records, Richard says, "The first counsel I received after reaching Nauvoo was from Elder John Taylor. Soon they began to hear rumors that the church leaders were practicing a doctrine called celestial marriage, which led to a disagreement among members and many apostatized. In the spring of 1844, Richard Ballantyne was invited by John Taylor to dine with him and his family. After which, Apostle Taylor introduced the doctrine of plural marriage to him. Richard says he was shocked and appalled by the idea, but later accepted it. And within a very short time, his sister Jane became a plural wife of John Taylor. And Annie married John Taylor at winter quarters in 1847, but divorced him just a few years later in 1852. He also married Sophia and Harriet Whitaker, who were 22 and 31 years old. And Harriet was a part of John Taylor's company that made the trek west in 1847, and she married him shortly after arriving in the Salt Lake Valley.
I just find it insane. See, this is what I want to point out here is John Taylor is on a mission, right? And he's seeing women that he wants, and he's inviting the brother over to his house, and he's having dinner. This is how a predator works. They start grooming the family members and the people and using their authority in this church and all of that to get these women. It's such a calculated and disgusting thing that you see. And it's so interesting to me as I was going through all of these records. I'm not just looking at FamilySearch. I'm looking at documents that were attached to their records. And I could not believe how many LDS families would praise these ancestors of theirs for entering into these polygamous marriages and their sacrifices. And I thought this is just so disgusting. Anyway, moving on. Thomas Whitaker, Sophia and Harriet's father, had remarried after the death of their mother, and his new wife opposed the principles of the gospel, like a polygamy. So we have a man who is, married, and his wife is not having any of this crap, right? John Taylor, Parley P. Pratt, and Orson Hyde were sent to England to settle some business there. And after they settled their business, they took Harriet, Sophia, and their other sister Elizabeth with them back to Council Bluffs. So they just take these young women back. Anyways, it's very interesting how they just start collecting women and traveling with women, young women. I find really odd. I don't think that we would find that very acceptable today either. The family, typing out her story, claimed that she was a lovely English girl and married John Taylor as his fifth wife 2 days after her 22nd birthday. John Taylor was 39. The predatory nature of these marriages, as these young women were in the care of these older men who were bringing them back to the U.S. and then they're marrying them. They are preying on them and convincing them to marry them. It's just a sick and twisted thing, to say the very least. But John Taylor's predatory behavior doesn't stop there. So we have Margaret Young. She was 19 years old when they were married, and he was 48. So at 47 years old, John Taylor was a high-ranking LDS missionary, and he targeted 19-year-old Margaret Young. She was a young, impressionable school teacher with her whole life ahead of her. As the president of the Eastern States Mission, John Taylor wielded immense influence over her, using his religious authority to lure Margaret into a web of control, much like he had done with other vulnerable women before. Margaret had only been a member of the church for a few years. She had converted at 15 years old. At a critical age, when she was still forming her beliefs and her identity, still in her teenage years, Taylor, nearly 3 decades her senior, groomed her under the guise of spiritual mentorship, ultimately persuading her to become yet another plural wife in his eternal collection. On September 27, 1856, Margaret sealed her fate, marrying the much older Taylor and trading her future for a life of submission in polygamous hierarchy that she had little say in. Immediately after the marriage, John Taylor tore her away from everything she had ever known, forcing her to leave behind her career and her family and move to Utah in 1857, where she became just another cog in the machine of Mormon polygamy. Over the years, she bore 9 children, fulfilling her role as a breeding vessel for the church. Her life dictated by a man who had orchestrated the entire situation from the beginning. Margaret's story isn't one of romance or faith. It is one of coercion, spiritual abuse, power imbalance, and religious manipulation, where a predatory missionary took advantage of a young convert, stripped her of her agency, and trapped her in a system that valued her as nothing more than an obedient wife and an eternal childbearer. Margaret's story is not the only predatory missionary story that highlights John Taylor's missionary efforts as more of a predatory effort to fill his harem. He was more interested in that than converting people to the religion. Anne Hewlings, who was another wife in his eternal harem, she wasn't young when she married John Taylor, but her story is a prime example of the predatory behavior of missionaries and church leaders in their insatiable pursuit of women. According to Anne Hewlings' FamilySearch records, she was originally married to Solomon Hewlings on October 3rd, 1825, and she had 7 children with her husband. During the early 1840s, John Taylor, who was a missionary for the LDS Church, stayed at the inn that Anne and her husband Solomon operated. While boarding there, Taylor introduced Anne to the teachings of Mormonism, and she soon converted to the faith. Her decision to join the church created a deep divide between her and her husband Solomon, who chose not to convert.
And Anne decided to leave her husband and homeland behind for a newfound faith, embarking on the journey to America with her children. She later married John Taylor on January 30th, 1846, and just before the Saints began their trek westward. Tragically, Anne's journey came to an untimely end. She passed away at winter quarters on October 26th, 1846, leaving behind her 5 surviving children, motherless in a foreign land, thousands of miles away from their father. And all this information was gathered from her FamilySearch records. And Anne Hewling's story is a haunting example of the predatory nature of early LDS missionaries, and particularly the tactics used by men like John Taylor to isolate, manipulate, and exploit vulnerable women. Anne was a married woman with several children, running an inn with her husband, when Taylor, under the guise of being a missionary, entered their lives, and instead of simply preaching, he integrated himself into their home, ultimately convincing Anne to abandon her husband and take their children to America, all while Solomon refused to convert. And Taylor's actions shattered a family, leaving Solomon behind as Anne uprooted her children from their homeland and severing ties to their father forever. And the ultimate betrayal? Taylor married Anne himself on January 30th, 1846, solidifying his grip on her after destroying her marriage and coercing her into leaving her home and husband. But the consequences were devastating. Within months, Anne was dead, succumbing to the brutal conditions of winter quarters on October 26, 1846, leaving her 7 children motherless in a foreign land, entirely at the mercy of the Mormon community that had torn them from their past lives. And this was not an act of love or faith or divine guidance. It was just him being a predator, pure and simple. John Taylor, like many LDS leaders, used his position as of being a leader in the church to take advantage of a married woman, breaking her apart from her family, and ultimately leading her to an early grave. Anne's story serves as a tragic testament to the dangers of unchecked religious power and manipulation, and the lives left in the ruins as a result. Now that we've detailed some of John Taylor's abhorrent behavior towards women, let's move on to the next church leader, which was Wilford Woodruff.
Now, Wilford Woodruff, he was an apostle who later became a prophet. Again, that story with Anne is just, I don't know, that hit hard as I was reading that. And I do want to clarify, I had written, she had 7 children, 2 of them died as infants, so she did only take 5 with her. I think I may have put 7. Anyway, she did have 7 children, but 2 of them passed away before they made that trek west. So when we look at Wilford Woodruff, again, we're not highlighting all of his wives. And in fact, just to give an interesting fact, I don't remember what birthday it was of his, so don't quote me on this, but he was 70, he was an older man. For his birthday, he had like 170 women sealed to him in a temple. That was his birthday gift, so that he could have these hundreds of women in the celestial kingdom. So that's just an interesting kind of abusive tactic. I mean, I'm sure these women didn't consent to this. So very interesting. But anyway, with him, we look at Sarah Delight Stocking. She was barely 18 years old when she married him, but he was 50. Sarah's parents, this is the interesting story though. You think, oh, well, she was technically an adult. Yeah, barely. But this is where this story gets really twisted. Her parents betrothed her to Wilford Woodruff in Nauvoo. And this is according to the document on her FamilySearch records. It is critical that you understand that her family immigrated to Salt Lake City in 1850. She was 11 years old. So if she was betrothed, we're doing math here, okay? If she was betrothed to Wilford Woodruff before they came to Salt Lake City while they were in Nauvoo, that means that she was betrothed to Wilford Woodruff prior to being 11 years old. Okay, parents are willing to give their daughter to this old man. When she was living in Harriman, Utah, a young man came to see her. So, of course, she's a pretty young girl. Boys are coming to see her. This is a normal part of youth, right? Her stepmother forced the young men to sit near her so she could hear every word that they were saying. And then her father starts realizing that young men are starting to become interested in Sarah as she's getting older. And he told her that the time had come for her marriage to 50-year-old Wilford Woodruff. Her father hitched up the wagon, put her in it, forced her, and took her to Salt Lake City, where Brigham Young married Sarah to Wilford Woodruff. Sarah had just turned 18. Wilford Woodruff was 50 years old. They were married on July 31st, 1857. This young girl was forced into a marriage by her parents. And the reason probably was one of these dynastic ideas that they are giving their daughter to an apostle, thinking that this is securing some sort of celestial reward for them, which is how it was sold to a lot of people. This is how this trafficking ring was happening with these very, very young girls. These old men are claiming all this power and authority of God and will give you blessings in the afterlife if you essentially traffic your daughter to us. And a lot of people were willing to do it to secure some sort of blessing. But she was forced into this marriage. She was denied the opportunity of courting other young boys of her age, which was normal at the time. So when we say, oh, we can't apply our moral values, no, courting other young people around your age, that was normal behavior in the 1800s. Then we moved to Sarah Eleanor Brown. She was 18. She was married to Wilford Woodruff when she was 30, or when he was 39. So again, he was about twice her age. Sarah's story is another sordid tale of so-called missionary work in the church. How are we seeing this so common among these apostles going out as missionaries and dragging young girls home? Wilford Woodruff was a missionary in the area where Sarah lived and worked. Their marriage only lasted a few short weeks. calling into serious question the level of coercion that may have resulted in this marriage between a teenage girl and an older man that was married to a lot of women. Because obviously, if the marriage only lasted a few weeks, it probably was not consensual because she divorced him. Very interesting, though. Then we move into Mary Caroline Barton. She was 17. He was 39. He married 17-year-old Mary Barton on the exact same day that he married 18-year-old Sarah Eleanor Brown. So again, just another kind of disgusting situation. His marriage to Mary Caroline also only lasted a few weeks, again indicating that this marriage was probably more religious abuse and coercion than anything else. And then we have Emma Smith. Now, this is not Joseph Smith's, obviously, wife. She was probably named Emma after Emma Smith. She was only 15 years old when she was married to Wilford Woodruff, and he was 46 years old. She is yet another victim of the missionary efforts of the early church. How often do we keep saying this throughout this episode? Wilford Woodruff met her parents while he was on a mission in Kentucky. Disturbingly, Wilford Woodruff writes about staying in Emma Smith's parents' home during his mission. Emma's family made the trek to Salt Lake City in Wilford Woodruff's company when she was only 12 years old. He probably set his sights on her at this point, just like earlier ones. When Emma was 15, she was sealed to Wilford Woodruff on March 13, 1853. And in his journal, Wilford recorded that he was sealed at 7 p.m. to both Emma Smith and Sarah Brown by Brigham Young. So again, just another evidence of this disgusting behavior of these men who call themselves apostles and prophets. We have Sarah Brown. She was 19 years old. He was 46. She was married to Wilford Woodruff on the same day as 15-year-old Emma Smith. The marriage practices of these self-proclaimed prophets were nothing short of predatory. I mean, here we are. We just take like several teenage girls and we just line them up in the temple. Just bam, bam, bam. We're just going to marry them all on the same day. That's normal. That's God. God is like, hey, this is how we do this. Just pick up a bunch of teenage girls and let's just marry them one right after the other. This is predatory. This is abusive. This is not of God. This is blasphemous to say that this comes from God. It's just absolutely disgusting.
It absolutely is. And he also ended up marrying Eudora Young, which was Brigham Young's daughter. And she was 25 years old, and he was 70 years old. Wilford Woodruff was 70, she was 25. While it's true she wasn't underage at this time, she was 25. There's that massive age difference here. A 25-year-old marrying a 70-year-old is
and also
disgusting.
This trafficking between prophets and apostles of their own daughters.
Yeah.
Insane.
And it is ridiculous. And her marriage to Wilford Woodruff was on March 10th, 1877. And again, it was another example of the transactional, power-driven polygamous unions that defined early LDS leadership. Merely months after their sealing, Wilford ensured that Eudora underwent her second anointing on March 21st, 1877, which is a secretive and elite temple ritual reserved for those deemed most faithful. And we've actually done an entire video on the second anointing, so I highly recommend you go check that one out as well. And this second anointing was yet another mechanism used to indoctrinate women into submission and solidify their loyalty to much older husbands. She spent several months performing temple work at Wilford's side, playing the role of the dutiful plural wife, all while likely grappling with the reality of her limited agency in the shadow of an aging religious leader. And she moved to Salt Lake City later that year, after Wilford returned in August of 1877, following the death of Brigham Young, a man whose own predatory behavior and polygamous history mirrored Woodruff's. In a tragic turn, she gave birth to Wilford's son on April 1st, 1878, but the infant only lived a few hours. And rather than allowing her to grieve in peace, Woodruff took the opportunity to honor his fallen prophet by naming the child Brigham Young Woodruff, ensuring even in death that Young's name and influence loomed over every aspect of their lives. The child was buried in St. George Cemetery, and whatever emotions Eudora may have felt in the aftermath were likely overshadowed by the rigid expectations placed on plural wives. But she refused to remain trapped. By the end of 1878, she had walked away from Wilford, seeking a new life outside of the oppressive system of polygamy and control. Her decision to leave led her to Judge Albert Hagen, a Californian mining attorney who was not a member of the LDS Church, which was a stark contrast to the men who had previously controlled her life up to that point. The fact that Hagen had previously worked as a legal advocate for Annalisa Young, Brigham Young's outspoken ex-wife, only adds to the significance of her escape. Newspaper reports at the time swirled with scandal surrounding Dora and Hagen's relationship. Albert's wife, Mary, was mysteriously institutionalized under highly suspicious circumstances right before his marriage to Dora on March 1st, 1879. Mary was conveniently locked away for 25 years before an outside intervention finally secured her release. And a chilling footnote in a saga of manipulation, power struggles, and the abandonment of women who became inconvenient to the men who once ruled their lives. And Dora's story is not one of a faithful wife, but a woman who saw this suffocating reality of polygamy and chose to break free, while many Mormon women remained chained to a doctrine that dictated their existence. And Dora rejected the role forced upon her, leaving behind a high-ranking prophet and a system that saw her as nothing more than a spiritual commodity. Her escape to a man who had once fought against Brigham Young's unchecked power was the ultimate act of defiance in a church that demanded total submission.
These women, some of these women, like Annalisa, she's just one of my heroes. Just the courage that she had in escaping Brigham Young and the destroying angels that could have taken her life as she was leaving. And then Eudora also just, walking away from all of the threats to her eternal salvation. It's really powerful because it was very difficult for these women. There was a lot of threats against them. So we're going to move into George A. Smith, who was another apostle. I don't believe this is George Albert Smith who became a prophet, but a lot of them had very similar names, so it can get really confusing. So I'm not going to say that that's who this is. But George A. Smith, he married Hannah Libby. She was 17 years old. He was 28. And then he married Hannah Libby's sister, Sarah Ann Libby, on the exact same day. We really going to claim that that's just normal? We can't apply today's morals to this? Like, are we really seeing this happening through the 19th century everywhere? Or are we only seeing this in Mormonism? Let's be real. So we have another apostle in the LDS Church marrying young sisters. There's something normal about this. Then let's move on to Orson Hyde. He was an apostle who was reinstated. So I believe that he either left or was excommunicated, and then he was reinstated. So Orson Hyde, his first wife, now we're going to talk about his legal wife, and there's a reason for this. So Miranda Nancy Johnson, the interesting thing is she was married to Joseph Smith, and on her record, it says that she was married to Joseph Smith in 1842. But she was married to Orson Hyde in 1834. So somehow she ends up being married to Joseph Smith. Orson Hyde got sent on a mission, and she gets married to Joseph Smith while she's still married to Orson Hyde, one of Joseph Smith's apostles. This is an extremely convoluted thing. So she was married to Orson Hyde when she was 19 years old. It sounds like Joseph Smith had his eye on her. They were married in Kirtland, Ohio. So she was married to Orson Hyde in Kirtland, Ohio. And Orson was a prominent member of the early Latter-day Saint movement. He was called to be an apostle shortly after they got married. This is probably all very calculated. And then in 1842, during Orson's extended mission to Jerusalem, Miranda is sealed to Joseph Smith. The sealing likely occurred without Orson Hyde's knowledge, as he was out of the country at the time. So the exact nature of the sealing, whether it was for time and eternity or whatever, doesn't really matter, because it was a disgusting betrayal of one of his close associates in the church. And that just remains a topic of historical discussion. People argue about this all the time. I don't see anything ethical, though. Even if you say it was for eternity, you just robbed a man of his wife in the eternities behind his back. How is that okay? You know, oh, it's just for eternity. They didn't have sex. That doesn't matter. You just robbed a man of his wife, according to your beliefs. That's just not okay either. So after Orson returned from his mission, he continued his marriage with Miranda, and they were also later sealed to each other in the Nauvoo Temple in 1846. And then their relationship eventually ended in divorce in 1870. Just an interesting kind of twisted tale there. Then we move on to Helen Melissa Winters. This is a big issue, though. Orson Hyde was 52 and Helen was 12. The church website confirms that he did, in fact, marry Helen when she was 12 years old. And we have a link to exactly where you can see that. However, she later married James Hickerson when she was 23 years old. The fact that this marriage happened when she was 12 years old is admitted by the church on their own website. But what I will say is there's no details about why this occurred, why this 12-year-old girl was being married to a 52-year-old apostle. Nor is there any information about a divorce prior to her marriage to James Hickerson. Everything about this marriage has just been kept very hush-hush. And I guess you can see why, being that she was only 12 years old. This would have been considered pedophile type behavior.
100% it would have. And it just continues on. We have Ann Eliza Vickers, who she was 16 years old and he was 52. When Ann Eliza was 16 years old, she had a boyfriend who was close in age to her, and she adored him. However, Orson Hyde stepped in and told her that he wanted her to be his wife. He was, just screw the boyfriend. I want you to be my wife, which is ridiculous. And Anne was raised by her grandparents, and her relatives pressured her into marrying this 52-year-old man. Pointing out again, she's 16 here, marrying a 52-year-old man. And they told her that if she had an opportunity to marry an apostle of the one true Church of God, she's got to accept his proposal. So, because of all this pressure from her family, she did end up accepting his proposal. Again, she's an underage girl who was pressured by her family into marrying an old man. And she lived alone for all of her life because she did not want to live in a polygamous home with all of his other wives. And she was only 17 when she had her first child. So again, we have another situation where you cannot claim that these relationships had no sexual whatever. She's having children at 17 years old.
With a 52-year-old.
With a 52-year-old, exactly. It's insane. Yeah. There's no way around this. And then we've got Sophia Margaret Lyon, who was 18 years old, marrying a 60-year-old man. And also, I don't think this marriage needs much explanation. It's simply another example of the predatory behavior of early apostles in the church. These 50, 60-year-old men are marrying 12, 16, 18-year-old girls. It's disgusting. I have no words for this. So now let's jump over into Parley P. Pratt. So his first wife was about 10 years older than him. And then we move over to his first underage bride, which was Anne Agatha Walker. She was 17 years old when he was 40 years old when they got married. So the backstory behind this was Parley P. Pratt went on a mission to England and he met her family. And her whole family joined the church. And when Parley completed his mission, he convinced this 17-year-old girl to come back to America with him. And during the trek west, she married Parley P. Pratt at winter quarters. She was his 10th wife, and had 5 children with him. Her first child was born when she was 19 and he was about 41. And the only reason that Parley P. Pratt did not continue his predatory behavior of marrying young women is that his life was cut short by a jealous husband. Parley had seduced this man's wife and was living in open adultery with this woman.
So this is an interesting story, and we've touched on this in our Mountain Meadows Massacre episode because it also plays a role in the Mountain Meadows Massacre and everything that happened there. So if you want to know more of how this kind of played a role in that, you can watch that one as well. But the murder of Parley P. Pratt in May 1857 was a stark example of the exploitive nature of early Mormon polygamy. These missionaries were constantly seducing young women and then marrying them. And sometimes it was married women. So Pratt, who was an apostle in the LDS Church at the time, was killed by Hector McLean. Hector was a man who was seeking justice after Pratt seduced and illegally married McLean's wife, Eleanor. Eleanor was never divorced from Hector, making her so-called marriage to Pratt not only immoral, but outright adultery under the law. She was lured away from her husband and children under the false promise that only by becoming Pratt's 12th wife could she obtain eternal salvation. A coercive, manipulative tactic that was central to early Mormon polygamous doctrine. This was spiritual abuse, plain and simple. McLean desperately pursued legal recourse against Parley P. Pratt for seducing his wife and then living in open adultery with her, attempting to reclaim his wife. And she obviously was trying to get the children as well, but there's a lot of legal dynamics that were at play there. But the legal system failed Hector. When Hector learned that Pratt had been released from jail, he tracked him down in Fine Springs, Arkansas, where he shot and stabbed him to death. Far from being the innocent martyr that Mormons try to claim he was, Pratt was murdered for his role in destroying a marriage and manipulating a woman into illegal polyandry. Hector defended his actions as those of a husband protecting his family from a religious predator, which I would have to say was exactly what was happening. It was a sentiment echoed in the press at the time. Pratt's murder fueled anti-Mormon sentiment and exposed the deceptive and abusive tactics Mormon leaders used to entrap women into polygamous relationships, showing the dark reality behind the LDS Church's celestial marriage doctrine. So as you can see, these marriages destroyed families. We've detailed several of them where women were actually lured away from their own families. They were really good at convincing them, I'll tell you that. So then we move into Orson Pratt. He was also one who either was excommunicated or away from the church and then reinstated, is what it looked like on his records. So his first polygamous teenage marriage that we have listed is Adelia Ann Bishop. She was 19, he was 33. They had 6 children, but the more despicable aspect of this is that he married her sister Charlotte Bishop, and Charlotte was 21. So these were, even though they weren't, Charlotte was not a teenager, they were sisters and they were quite young. They were much younger than him. Then we go to Juliet Ann Phillips. She was 16 and he was 44. So again, this is an absolutely despicable marriage. For a man to be marrying a girl very, very much young enough to be his daughter. And then we have Margaret Graham, who was also 16, but he was 57. So here's another despicable aspect of this marriage. Margaret had her first child with Orson Pratt at 17 years old. Now people say, it was common for teenage girls to get married. First of all, we've proven that that's not true, but also it was not common for a 17-year-old girl to have a child with a 58-year-old man. There was nothing normal about this. And it was no more accepted at that time than it would be now.
And then we got Amasa Lyman. And his first young bride was Caroline Partridge. And she was 17 years old, and he was 31. And she was a sister to Eliza and Emily Partridge, who were married to Joseph Smith. Emily was barely 19 years old, and Eliza was 22 years old. Joseph was 38 years old when he married Emily and Eliza. And it really seems as though these families were trafficking their young daughters to church leaders. And when that church leader would die, the young woman didn't find a husband of her own. They were just married to another church leader. And Amasa Lyman then married Eliza Partridge about 3 months after Joseph Smith died, just weeks after he married her 17-year-old sister. And then we've got Cornelia Levitt. She was 19 and he was 31. And we got Priscilla Turley. She was 16 years old and he was 32. And according to a document attached to Priscilla's FamilySearch records, Amasa Lyman was good friends with Priscilla Turley's father. And there is a story of an angry man chasing Amasa Lyman, and Priscilla let him hide in the attic until the man left. And Amasa stayed in their home for a few days before returning to his own house. The claim is that church authorities insisted that Amasa Lyman take on other wives. And this is generally the excuse that many use to make it seem as though these men were so reluctant and these poor men were forced to marry these underage girls against their will. There's far more compassion given to these men than the true victims in these scenarios, which is the underage girls and women who were essentially forced into these despicable marriages and situations. And his good friend Theodore Turley apparently asked Amasa to please take one of his daughters. Men typically traffic their daughters to their friends or to church leaders as some sort of elevation of their righteousness. Priscilla's father did offer his older daughters, but Amasa demanded 16-year-old Priscilla to be his wife. So Amasa took 6 young women and married them all at the same time.
I don't have words for this. I really don't. And I know I say it all the time, but I don't understand apologists. I don't understand how you can, this man is saying, take my daughters, and he's offering older ones, and then Amasa's like, no, I demand the 16-year-old. Excuse me? And you do it? Like, I just don't understand. Anyway, moving on to more of his teenage brides, we have Paulina Phelps. Now remember, he took 6 of these young women, these teenagers, and married them all at the same time, one fell swoop. And I do want to make a comment here really quickly that this is the reason that no outsiders still to this very day are allowed to attend temple sealings, because it basically has always been that way, because there were all these secret polygamous marriages that were happening and they didn't want outsiders being privy to what was really happening. And they've just kept the same tradition. So anyway, she was 18, he was 32. So very little is spoken of Paulina's marriage to Amasa Lyman. In the memories attached to her records, it seems as though she mostly lived alone and she kind of just fended for herself, which, you know, a lot of the apologists will say, oh, they were marrying widows and they were marrying them so they could take care of them and provide for them. How many people out there today could support 6 families all at once, to feed all of them, to house all of them, to clothe all of them? You can't do it. A lot of these women did have to fend for themselves, and we've detailed several of these women that lived alone, and she was one of them. It was just common for them to have to fend for themselves, and Eliza Webb also had to fend for herself as one of Brigham Young's wives. It just wasn't financially feasible to be able to provide from anywhere to 6 to 40 different families. Some of these men were married to 45 different women, you know. Members of the church tried to avoid the truth that these men did not have the financial resources to live this way. And it's interesting to say God commanded something that was just not even feasible. Even today, we couldn't do such a thing. Then we move on to Laura Lucinda Reed. She was 16. Again, he was 32. He had a real kind of eye for these young teenage girls. In her records, it states that she married Amasa Lyman in January 1846, but then she married Thomas Steed in December of 1846, which I find really interesting. There are 44 memories attached to her record, and none of them mention her marriage to Amasa Lyman. It's on there, so it says she was married, but as far as like any of the records that you can find, stories or anything like that, nothing mentions him. So it may have been similar to the ones where, they divorced or moved on. I don't know. These underage marriages are often not mentioned due to their unsavory nature. And the LDS families who manage to upload all of these stories and records try to focus on more legitimate marriages that happened later in their life, or just try to avoid admitting the fact that this young girl was married by a church leader at 16 years old. So he married three other sisters. He married a group of three sisters, like we talked earlier, Eliza, Caroline, and Lydia Partridge. So again, not just a pair of sisters, three different ones. And Eliza was one that was married to Joseph Smith. It gets so twisted. It's insane. It's not just Joseph Smith and Brigham Young that were terrible in their practice of this. It was all of them. Then we go to Ezra T. Benson. And the reason I bring up his first wife, she was 22 years old. As you notice, most of the time when their first wife, we're not even mentioning them as being underage. Most of them were around 21, 22 years old. Well, the reason I bring her up, Pamela Andress, is because he married her sister Adeline Andress. How can you imagine marrying a man as his wife, being his legal wife, and then he goes and marries her sister? I don't know. It was very, very common among church leaders to do such a thing. Then we have his first teenage marriage, which was Eliza Ann Perry. She was 18, he was 36. So he was more than twice her age. And here's another one of these missionary type stories. Eliza joined the church in England, and her family sent her to assist Ezra Benson and his family on the trek west. So this is a young teenage girl who was sent to help the family with the children and all of that. She was going to work in his home and assist with the care of the children. So we talk about Joseph Smith marrying the teenage, babysitters and housemaids in his house. They all did this. She is an 18-year-old girl living in his home as a nanny. And he marries her at winter quarters in 1847. Winter quarters is as they're on this difficult, dangerous trek west, they stop at winter quarters to marry these women that they have trafficked from other countries. It's very common. And this was done when she was 18 years old. When Eliza's parents found out about the marriage, they were very unhappy about it. This was not what her parents had envisioned for their daughter when they sent her to the United States to be with the saints. Most converts to the church in England were not taught about polygamy, so they had no idea that this was a danger that their daughter was getting into. And they only found out about her polygamous marriage to him upon arriving in Salt Lake City. So again, how can you claim that this is of God when, it's just every single one of them. Really, honestly, this was just a sex cult. That's all it was. So we're going to move on to, yes?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Charles C. Rich, who was an apostle in the Quorum of the 12. And we'll move on to his role in this entire thing.
Yeah. So his first wife, Sarah Durman P., was 24 years old when they got married. And then with his teenage brides, Mary Ann Phelps, she was 16 and he was 36. And in her records, the descendants merely applauded her sacrifice and hardship in her polygamous marriage. They completely ignore the fact that she is 16 years old, and there's absolutely no information on how this marriage was arranged. And her first child was born when she was 19 years old, which it was not abnormal for the 19th century. However, it was wildly inappropriate that this child was born with a much older man who was almost twice her age. And we got Sarah Jane Peck. She was 19 and he was 36. And according to the documents on her FamilySearch records, she was known, she had known the Rich family for many years. So Charles knew this girl while she was growing up and in her preteen years. Her sister married Thomas Rich, who was a cousin to Charles. And as we can see here, it's very common for families to practically sell their daughters to church leaders to purchase greater salvation for their daughters and for their families. The idea was that this higher level of priesthood that was held by your husband, the higher their priesthood, the higher your glory in heaven, and the higher level you are in the celestial kingdom, which is ridiculous. Like, hey, I'm higher up in this made-up priesthood I have. Marry me so you can make it to higher heaven, which it's stupid. And then his next wife, Millian Grover, she was 15 years old and he was 37. And many believe it was just Joseph Smith or Brigham Young and maybe Heber C. Kimball that behaved as predators towards these underage girls. But this is not the case. As we've seen with so many examples, it wasn't just them. There were so many. And it wasn't just Joseph Smith who married underage girls who were working in his home. This was the MO of most of the leaders of the church. And Charles C. Rich was one of them who did this same thing. Emmeline had lost her mother, and her father had a lot of children to provide for. So Emmeline began working in the homes of church members by the age of 9. She's 9 years old, going to work in the homes of church members and church leaders. In 1846, she was working in Charles Rich's home as a maid and housekeeper. During this time, when the Saints had stirred up a lot of hostility with non-Mormons in the area, the Rich family were going to move west. The claim is that her family loved Emmeline, and so it was decided that Charles would marry the 15-year-old girl. And she wrote in her diary about this marriage. She says, "Now my troubles and hardships had just begun. If I had a hard life before, I certainly had a much harder one after this most important step in my life." And her first child was born when she was 18 years old, and her husband was 40, which is ridiculous, more than twice her age.
Yeah, the thing with this is, we said on a lot of these records, the families were applauding these women's sacrifices. And I'm like, this isn't a sacrifice. This is religious abuse. When underage girls are being convinced to do these things. And I also want to point out here, you'll notice a lot of these girls that are 15, 16 years old that are getting married, and it's a couple of years before they have a child. And people may say, oh, intimacy may not have been happening when they were younger or whatever. That's actually not the case. One of the things that you have to realize, according to a lot of the statistics and records, is that the age of puberty back then was around 17 or 18 years old. So a lot of these girls would not have even been able to get pregnant, most likely, based on the ages that they were when they were married. So, which just adds a whole nother layer to this behavior that was going on. So then we're going to move into Harriet Sargent. Again, she's 15 years old, and he was 38 when they were married. Harriet was only 13 years old when she was placed in the care of Charles C. Rich by her widowed father. We keep seeing it wasn't the widows that they were marrying and trying to take care of them and provide for them. This is a 13-year-old girl. Charles C. Rich is a guardian for her. Then she is placed in the care of this 38-year-old, actually at the time, 36-year-old man by her widowed father. Her father expected Charles and his wife, Sarah, to take care of his young daughter, this grieving father. It was said that Harriet was very beautiful. And so when she turns 15, Charles proposes marriage to her. This is a young girl who had lost her mother. Again, it's not just Joseph Smith that has literally no conscience whatsoever. None of these men did. This system turned the men into absolute predatory brutes. They were heartless. She's placed in the care of this couple who are old enough to be her parents. And instead of taking care of her like a child, like they should have, Charles has the perverted audacity to propose marriage to this little girl. There's nothing righteous and there's nothing of God about this behavior at all. And I hope that you see as we've done this, I know this is a long episode, but there are so many leaders of the church that were doing this. So then we move on to Lorenzo Snow. And he became prophet later on. Begins, the marriages begin as he's an apostle and he becomes prophet later on. So his first wife, Mary Adeline Goddard, she was 33 years old when she married him and he was 31. So they were older. Then, as is always, he turns his sights on teenage girls. And the first one is Sarah Ann Pritchard. She's 18. He's 31. And then we moved to Charlotte Squires. She was 19. He was 31. So again, if you notice his age, he's just one right after the other marrying these girls. Charlotte, unfortunately, died at the age of 25. And then we move on to Eleanor Houts. She was 15 years old and he was 34. So she was definitely close to young enough to be his own daughter. And there's a document attached to Eleanor's father's FamilySearch account. I tell you, I did a lot of research for this. We find out the predatory nature in which Lorenzo Snow proposed to this girl when she was 14 years old. This is attached to her father's account. And it says, Eleanor and her parents were leaving church when Lorenzo Snow joined them. As they walked along, Lorenzo asked 14-year-old Eleanor if she would promise that one day she would become his wife. Though at the time she was only 14, she did make that promise. Now realize this is a man who is seen as a religious leader in her church. How is she supposed to say no? And how can we consider this to be consent? They were then married when she was 15 years old and he was 34. What 34-year-old man just walks up to a young girl walking home from church with her family and proposes to her? It's absolutely inconceivable. But then, if that wasn't bad enough, we've got, notice her last name, Eleanor Houts, right? Oh, our next one, Mary Elizabeth Houts. Huh? He marries her at 16 years old, and now he's 43. Eleanor and Mary, so 15-year-old Eleanor and 16-year-old Mary were cousins that he married, which is just another very odd and twisted thing to be doing. Then we move on to Phoebe Amelia Woodruff. She was barely 17 years old and he was 45. The other twisted thing about this is she's Wilford Woodruff's daughter. So here's the thing. You will notice a lot of these apostles, their daughters will be married off to other apostles. There were a lot of obsessions with bloodlines and obsessions with, your station in the celestial kingdom. If you're marrying high up leaders of the church, they want their daughters marrying other apostles and having these higher stations in the celestial kingdom with people with high levels of priesthood. It was a very obsessive and twisted thing that they were doing. These women were not given the chance to date or court young boys of their own age, find a husband of their own choosing. They were held in reserve and then forced to marry leaders in the church. It was believed that the highest honor a woman could have would be to marry a man in the highest rankings of the priesthood. And therefore, it was not uncommon for church leaders to traffic their daughters to other church leaders or even very low stationed members. If you're not a bishop or you don't really have any standing in the church, it was very common for them to try to get their daughters to marry leaders higher up in the church because they kind of believed this idea that it would pull them up and give them higher station in the church. And then we move on to Sarah Jensen. She was 15 years old. He was 57 years old. This is a 15-year-old girl who marries a 57-year-old man. Under no circumstances should this have ever happened. He was old enough almost to be her grandfather. And then we'll move into Erastus Snow, who was also an apostle.
Yeah. So his underage bride, she was 16 years old and he was 29 years old. And Erastus Snow was the missionary who converted Elizabeth's family to the church. Elizabeth was only about 11 years old at the time. And according to the family's document on her records, they claim that she thought this 23-year-old man was the handsomest man that she had ever seen. And it's unforgivable that a family would actually place the blame for this underage marriage on the 11-year-old girl and claim that she found this other man attractive. When Erastus
What 11-year-old girl, even if she had a little crush on someone, why are we making this marriage okay? Because an 11-year-old girl, they claim, what are we doing?
It doesn't make any sense. Like, oh
I
my
mean,
goodness.
she's 11. And the fact that it almost sounds like they're trying to make an excuse of how it was okay because she thought he was cute when she was 11.
How does that
Anyway,
make
sorry.
it okay? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And when Erastus returned for his family in late 1847, it says that he took Elizabeth, who was only about 16 years old at the time, and he married her to be his third wife. And it's also important to know that Elizabeth's father provided Erastus and his wife a home free of charge for 2 years while they stayed in Salem. Elizabeth's father was well acquainted with Erastus, and it seems to be another case of a man trafficking his daughter to a leader of the church for lack of a better way to put it, for more points in the celestial kingdom. And then we've got Julia Josephine Spencer. She's 18 years old, and he was 38. So when Julia was 16 years old, she began working to pay for her tuition for school. She became close friends with Sarah Snow, who was the oldest daughter of Erastus Snow. She spent a lot of time in the Snow's home with his daughter and became well acquainted with the family. And then she was married to Erastus Snow as his fourth wife in 1856, when she was 18 years old. So, hold up here. This is his daughter's friend that he's marrying here, which is ridiculous. Like, oh, hey, daughter, you have a nice friend here. I'm going to marry her. What? It's insane. And then it just continues on with Franklin D. Richards. So his first wife, Jane Snyder, she was 19 years old and he was 21, which, okay, they're close in age, makes sense. But as all these other leaders of the church, he sets his sights on young girls. We got Elizabeth McFate. She was 16 years old and he was 24. And Franklin D. Richards was a high-ranking LDS apostle and epitomized the unchecked power and entitlement of early Mormon polygamous leaders. At just 25 years old, he took 16-year-old Elizabeth as his plural wife, binding her to him in the so-called celestial marriage, under the church's relentless doctrine of salvation through polygamy. But Elizabeth's fate was nothing short of tragic. Barely a year later, she was dead at winter quarters, a casualty of both the unforgiving conditions of the Mormon exodus and the suffocating demands of a religious system that saw young girls as disposable assets for men in power. She was never given a chance at a real life, only a life of servitude, illness, and an early grave.
These stories it's very sobering. A lot of what was happening. A lot of these young girls, they didn't need to leave England. They didn't need to leave the East. They didn't need to leave their homes. They didn't need to be married. None of this needed to happen, and none of this was of God. And when you see what they were doing and how they were going on missions and setting their sights on these young girls, it wasn't God. It was their own twisted perversions. And adding to the brutality of her story, Elizabeth died of tuberculosis while her sister wife, as they called them, Jane Snyder Richards, tended to her suffering. She never made it to Utah, never saw a future beyond the freezing, disease-ridden camps of winter quarters. And how did Franklin Richards handle this death of this girl? He carried on. He married more wives, fathering more children, climbing the ranks of the LDS Church. His legacy unscathed, while Elizabeth's body lay buried in a pioneer cemetery, forgotten by the very movement that stole her life from her. This was not faith. It was exploitation, pure and simple. Then we move on to Laura Snyder. She was 18 years old and he was 35. Franklin D. Richards' polygamous marriages exposed the deeply entangled dynastic arranged marriages in the early Mormon church. It was a system where women were shuffled like property between men of power. A 35-year-old, he took 18-year-old Laura Snyder as his wife in 1854. Yet she wasn't just any young bride. She was one of the 3 Snyder half-sisters that he married. Again, 3 sisters that he married, including Jane Snyder and Sarah Comstock Snyder. The fact that a man could collect multiple women from the same family like cattle under the guise of religious duty underscores the disturbing, coercive nature of Mormon polygamy, where young women were raised to believe their only chance at salvation was through submission to much older men in positions of power. But Franklin's predatory reach didn't stop with these young sisters. He also married 4 of his uncle Willard Richards' wives just 3 years after Willard's death. Nanny Longstreth, Susanna Bayless, and Rhoda Harriet Foss and Mary Thompson had all previously been sealed to Willard Richards. But after he passed away, Franklin stepped in to claim his dead uncle's wives as his own. Realize these women were his aunts, right? A stark example of how Mormon polygamy was not about love or even faith. It was about maintaining power within elite church bloodlines. Women were not given the freedom to chart their own futures. Instead, they were passed from one husband to another, their worth defined solely by their role as eternal plural wives in an oppressive patriarchal structure. Then we move on to George Q. Cannon, who was quite a prominent apostle in the LDS Church. And his first wife was 19. He was 27. This was one where there was a little bit more of an age difference. George Q. Cannon was a towering figure in early Mormonism. He was a powerful polygamist who exploited his status to collect young wives, including more sisters. So his first wife, Elizabeth, was 19 years old when she married him. But that was just the beginning. According to Sarah Jane Jennings' family record, she met George Q. Cannon in Brigham Young's office, and just a few months later, they were married in that very same office, strongly suggesting that this was an arranged and forced marriage. Oftentimes, Brigham Young would pull 2 people in his office and say, you guys are going to get married. And we have many, many, many stories of this happening. I'm just guessing this is probably the same thing since we do have records that it did occur. It's suggesting that it was a forced marriage and that it was probably orchestrated by Brigham Young. In 1858, when George Q. Cannon was 31 years old, he took 18-year-old Sarah as his plural wife, following the same disturbing pattern of early LDS leaders preying on young, impressionable women under the guise of religious duty. Rather than a marriage based on love or even choice, Sarah was handed off like property in a system where Brigham Young acted as the ultimate broker of women's futures.
But Cannon's polygamous reach didn't stop there. He married his legal wife, Elizabeth. He married her own sister, Emily Hoagland, demonstrating once again how polygamy was deeply rooted in familial consolidation and the utter disregard for any personal agency of the women. And now we're going to jump over into Brigham Young Jr. So Catherine Curtis Spencer was Brigham Young Jr.'s first wife, and marrying him at 19 years old, and the same age as her husband, which was the norm in the broader 19th century culture in the United States. But unlike his later marriages, this was monogamous at the beginning, but it wouldn't remain that way for very long. As the daughter of Orson Spencer, a prominent LDS leader, Catherine's marriage to Brigham Jr. was likely a union of elite Mormon bloodlines, securing her place within the church's upper ranks. Jane Maria Carrington was barely 17 years old when she was married off to 21-year-old Brigham Young Jr. in 1857. And as the daughter of Albert Carrington, another high-ranking Mormon leader, Jane was likely groomed from a young age for this role. Like many young Mormon brides, she had little to say about her future. Her marriage was more about church hierarchy and obedience than about love or personal choice. And Abigail Stevens' marriage to Brigham Young Jr. was one of the most egregious examples of predatory polygamy. At just 17 years old, she was forced into marriage with a 51-year-old man, which is a staggering age difference that highlights the exploitative nature of Mormon polygamy. And by 1887, federal laws were cracking down on plural marriage. And yet, Brigham Young Jr. still managed to take a teenage girl as his wife, demonstrating that the Mormon elite saw themselves as above both law and basic human decency. And then we jump into Joseph F. Smith. So Jelena Lamson was 16 years old when she was married off to 27-year-old Joseph F. Smith in 1866, making her his first plural wife. And like many young Mormon girls, Jelena had no real choice in the matter, as polygamous marriages were seen as a divine mandate for eternal salvation. And at an age when she should have been experiencing youth and independence, she was instead thrust into a role of a submissive wife and future mother in an ever-expanding polygamous household. And Sarah Ellen Richards, daughter of Willard Richards, was married to 29-year-old Joseph F. Smith. And she was 17 years old when they got married in 1868. And as the daughter of a powerful Mormon leader, Sarah's marriage was likely, again, less about love and more about keeping these elite families intertwined. Like all other high-ranking LDS men at the time, Smith continued the pattern of preying on young women, taking them into polygamous unions under the guise of religious duty, which is just sickening.
That doesn't stop there. Mary Taylor Schwartz was only 18 years old when she was forced into marriage with 46-year-old Joseph F. Smith. And anybody that thinks that an 18-year-old girl wants to marry a 46-year-old is just an idiot. That is not why this was happening. He was a man old enough to be her father. By 1884, polygamy was under increasing legal scrutiny. Yet Smith still insisted on taking another teenage bride, proving that the LDS leadership prioritized their own self-serving doctrine over the well-being of teenage girls. Rather than allowing Mary the chance to marry someone of her own age or build an independent life for herself, she was exploited in her youth, ensuring that she became yet another voiceless wife in his ever-growing eternal collection. So as you've seen, as we're going through this, you can see that this was the pattern: marrying teenage girls, marrying many women, taking other men's wives, getting women on their missions. It was an absolute trafficking of women from all over the place. So we're going to move on to Albert Carrington. And he was eventually excommunicated. Albert Carrington, which is an interesting story in itself. Albert Carrington's marital history is one of blatant polyandry, hidden relationships, and hypocrisy at the highest levels of the LDS Church. Mary Ann Rock was legally married to Samuel Covington, with whom she had 5 children between 1842 and 1859. However, she was simultaneously sealed to Albert Carrington in 1846. So realize she's having children at 1842 to 1859 with Samuel Covington, and right smack in the middle of that, in 1846, she marries Albert Carrington. And she has 5 more children with him between 1849 and 1858. So she's having children with both of these men at the same time. Her last child with Albert Carrington was 1858. Her last child with Samuel Covington was 1859. They're having children at the same time. It's just insane. This means that she's having children and being married to 2 men at the same time. It's a clear case of Mormon-sanctioned polyandry. This is a little bit more rare. In typical LDS revisionist history, FamilySearch has erased Samuel Covington's connection to Mary Ann on her record with Carrington. So it's really interesting how I had to kind of come across how this all happened. You can kind of tell something's going on, But they've whitewashed the reality of this polyandrous relationship. It takes a little bit of digging to find it. Another one of Carrington's wives, Elizabeth Ann Wright, was married to him in 1857. But a decade later, she married another man, Albert Dewey, which was in 1867. There's no documents that a divorce existed in the records between Elizabeth and Carrington. This does raise questions about whether she was still considered his wife or not. There's no way to know. But we do have the records that he did live in polyandry with another woman, so I don't know. But despite all of this, Carrington was not excommunicated for his polyandry or for any predatory marriages or anything like that. He was excommunicated for having an affair. And I find this really interesting because they're sleeping around all over the place. These men, you have men in their 50s marrying 12-year-olds. And yet, what's the difference? Like, I literally do not understand the difference. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. But it was on November 7th, 1885. He was kicked out of the LDS Church, and they called it gross immorality. Can you believe the audacity? These men are marrying 6, 7, 8 underage girls, and that's not gross immorality. But a man that has an affair with another woman when he's already got a million wives anyway, what's the difference? This is gross immorality. So, this hypocrisy is absolutely staggering. They are all openly practicing adultery, marrying teenage girls, and justifying relationships with women who already had living husbands. And yet, somehow, he is signaled out for this unchaste behavior, or unchaste conduct, as they called it. This punishment was really actually a farce because he was rebaptized and reinstated into the LDS Church 2 years later. But he never regained his seat in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles before his death in 1889, proving that even in a church rife with corruption and sexual exploitation at every turn, there were some sins too public for them to overlook. His excommunication wasn't about morality, it was about appearances.
And then we got Moses Thatcher, who was also excommunicated. And Moses Thatcher, just like many of the early LDS apostles, used his position to secure marriages that reinforced elite bloodlines rather than genuine relationships based on love or choice. This is a very common trend with most of these stories we're reading of. And his first wife, Celestina Ann Farr, was 16 years old when she first married him, and he was 19 years old at the time. Though she was his first wife, Thatcher, like many of his peers, continued to expand his polygamous household in a way that served church hierarchy rather than personal connection. One glaring example of this was his later marriage to Georgina Snow, the daughter of fellow apostle Erastus Snow. And when they married, Georgina was 23 and Thatcher was 43. We've got a 20-year age gap that highlights how apostles strategically married the daughters of other high-ranking church leaders. And Thatcher, despite following the expected pattern of plural marriage, was excommunicated in 1896 for not agreeing with other church leaders on the political manifesto, further demonstrating how LDS leadership was quick to turn on their own when they did not fall in line with authority. And then we've got Frances M. Lyman with Clara Caroline Callister. She was 19 years old when she married Francis Lyman, who was 29 years old, and they got married on October 9th, 1869. And as the daughter of a prominent polygamous family, Clara's marriage was likely arranged to strengthen ties between elite church leaders. Though she was legally an adult, the age gap and systemic expectation for young women to enter plural marriages meant that she had little agency in choosing her future. Like many first wives in polygamous marriages, Clara would later watch as her husband married another, much younger woman, one from her own family, which was Susan Delilah Callister, who was Clara's half-sister, who was only 21 when she became Frances' plural wife in 1884. And by this time, Lyman was 44, more than double her age. And this marriage was particularly disturbing because Susan and Clara, they were half siblings, sharing a father who was himself a polygamist. And then we've got John Henry Smith, who married Sarah Farr when she was just 15 years old. And it was just 10 days shy of her 16th birthday. And she was married off to 18-year-old John Henry Smith on October 20th, 1866. And this was a first marriage and was not unheard of in 19th century culture. The real story behind the marriage in this twisted tale of Mormon culture is exposed when you realize that as the daughter of Lauren Farr, a high-ranking church leader, Sarah's marriage was again not likely based on love or personal choice or whatever. It was a strategic ploy in combining Mormon families and with these arranged marriages to consolidate power and status.
Josephine Grossbeck became John Henry Smith's second wife at 19 years old when she married him on April 4th, 1877. This was at a time when polygamy was increasingly coming under legal scrutiny. At 28 years old, Smith was nearly a decade older than her, continuing the common LDS pattern of older men accumulating additional young wives as eternal status symbols within the church hierarchy. Raised in a system where women were told they could only secure their place in heaven through polygamous marriage, Josephine was likely conditioned from childhood to accept her fate. Then we have Philomena Callister. The exact date of her marriage is unknown. We do know that she died at age 28 in 1879. More disturbingly, her sisters Clara and Susan Callister were also handed over as plural wives to another apostle, Francis Lyman, reinforcing how daughters from prominent Mormon families were trafficked into polygamous marriages as a religious duty. This just happens over and over and over again. And then moving on to George Teasdale. Matilda Ellen Picton became George Teasdale's plural wife. She was 19 years old. He was 46. So again, more than twice her age. They were married on January 2nd, 1878. Matilda's union with Teasdale was part of the deeply ingrained LDS practice of older men taking young, impressionable women into polygamous marriages. It's almost like on repeat. It's hard to even say something else. It's like their spiritual religious duty. They're just marrying teenage girls. And I hope that as we've gone through this, you see this was the standard. This wasn't rare. This wasn't just one person. It wasn't just Joseph Smith. It wasn't just Brigham Young. It was all of them. Then we move in. So that was Matilda Picton. Now we have Mary Loretta Picton. She was Matilda's full sister. She also was only 19 years old when she was married off to 52-year-old George Teasdale on February 22nd, 1883. The 33-year age gap highlights the disturbing nature of these unions. Again, powerful men marrying very, very young girls. What choice would she have had? Raised in a system, your eternal salvation depends on submission to polygamy. You did not have a choice as a young woman. This was not your choice. He continued marrying very young polygamous wives post-1890 manifesto. When he was 69 years old, he married a 24-year-old young woman. So again, we're not going to go into all the post-manifesto marriages, which there were a ton of those among church leaders, but this is just a good example of one of those. And then we move into John W. Taylor. Nellie Eva Todd became John W. Taylor's first polygamous wife at age 19, marrying him on September 25th, 1888. He was 30 years old. Unlike his later plural marriages, this one occurred before polygamy was under extreme legal scrutiny. However, as the daughter of a devout LDS family, Nellie would have been groomed to marry a high-ranking church official, like many others. Janet Maria Woolley, who was another 19-year-old bride, was married to him when he was 31 years old. The rapid addition of another wife was likely due to the pressures of polygamy that were coming down from the U.S. government. So he likely did this before the 1890 manifesto, which demonstrates how deeply ingrained polygamy was at that time. He then married another woman in her early 20s when he was 42 years old, and he married another at 51. Even though they were not teenagers, still, again, massive, massive age gaps.
And then we got Mariner W. Merrill, and he married Serene Stanley when she was just 16 years old, and Merrill was 24 years old at the time, and they were married on June 5th, 1853. And like so many of these marriages, it was arranged to connect high-ranking bloodlines. And then we got Almira Jane Bainbridge, who was even younger at just 15 years old, and when she was given to 33-year-old Merrill in 1865, with an 18-year age gap. And her marriage exemplifies the deeply ingrained predatory nature of early Mormon polygamy, where middle-aged men claimed teenage girls as their brides under the guise of spiritual duty and securing their eternal salvation. And Almira was still a child by modern standards and had no real autonomy. And we got Maria Kingsbury, yet another 15-year-old bride, was married to 35-year-old Merrill in 1867 with a 20-year age difference. The Callister Kingsbury and Bainbridge families were all tightly woven into the LDS elite, making clear, again, like so many of these others, these weren't about romance. And Maria's childhood was stolen from her in the name of religious obedience and eternal salvation. A stark reminder that Mormon polygamy functioned as systemic exploitation of young girls for the benefit of powerful men. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, Mariner Merrill, a prominent leader in the church, entered into plural marriages with several women from Scandinavia. These unions raised questions about potential trafficking of foreign women, which we've talked about in a previous episode. Highly recommend you guys go check that out. And many of these women were converted overseas and brought to the United States to marry high-ranking church officials. Elna Johnson, born on October 30th, 1863, in Sweden, married Merrill in 1885 in Logan, Utah. And at the time of their marriage, she was only 21 years old and he was 53. Elna became Merrill's fifth wife, and together they had at least one son and 4 daughters. Elna lived in Logan, in Cache County, Utah, until her death on December 16th, 1950, at the age of 87. And we got Jenny Betty Victoria Jacobson, born on February 25th, 1858, in Denmark. And she married Mariner Merrill on March 11th, 1886. And she was 28 years old and he was 54 at the time of their marriage. And details about her life and marriage are limited, but we do know it did occur. And then Anna Sophia Anderson, born in 1870 in Sweden, married him on July 18th, 1889. And she was 19 years old and he was 57, which is just a ridiculous age gap. And again, details about her life and marriage are scarce once again.
Again, the biggest reason for a lot of these details is that these women were brought over and they were being trafficked, and then they didn't know about polygamy in the European countries. So they are being converted, brought over to the United States, and then they are married off to high-ranking church leaders. And that's why we're kind of detailing a bit of that. We have Hilda Eriksson, born in 1869 in Sweden, married to Mariner Merrill in 1901. She was 31, but he's 69. So again, most information about them these women are very limited. Their marriages, their lives, anything like that. We don't have a lot of records. These marriages of these Scandinavian women to significantly older, high-ranking LDS officials suggest a pattern where young female converts were brought to the United States, convinced that their eternal salvation was contingent upon entering polygamy. They were indoctrinated that the higher ranking the priesthood that this man had, the higher station they would have with the celestial kingdom. And they had nowhere to go. Once they got to Utah, all their money was gone. There was no way out. And so a lot of times that was just the only choice they had. And then we have Matthias Cowley. He resigned. His resignation was because of living in polygamy after the 1890 manifesto. So he married Luella Parkinson on her 19th birthday. when he was 31 years old. Not only was this another case of an older man marrying a teenager, this marriage happened again just prior to the manifesto, proving that Wilford Woodruff lied because he said they already were not teaching or practicing polygamy, when in fact these marriages were still happening. Then we look at John R. Winder, who was a first counselor in the first presidency. He married Hannah Thompson in 1854. She was barely 19 years old. He was 33. Over and over and over again. Maria Burnham, 24 years old, married John Winder when he was 72 years old. This is almost a 50-year age difference. She ended up being more of a caretaker than an actual wife. And this also occurred 3 years after the manifesto claiming they weren't doing this anymore. For decades, the LDS Church has tried to bury the truth about its leaders and their obsession with marrying teenage girls. Under the guise of divine commands of God, they want you to believe that polygamy was about faith and sacrifice and celestial rewards, and it was commanded of God, and these people were just amazing for doing it. But history tells a much darker story. These were not holy men. They were powerful leaders who used their influence to take young, impressionable girls as brides, claiming that it was God who required it. These were not equal partnerships. These were not loving marriages. These were relationships built on power, coercion, and manipulation. Let's not sugarcoat it. This was systemic, institutionalized grooming. Apostles in their 40s, 50s, and even 60s were taking teenage brides as young as 12 years old, knowing full well they had total control over them. These young women had no choice. They were raised in a system that told them they would be damned if they refused and exalted if they submitted. This was not faith. This was predatory spiritual abuse masquerading as religion. And what did the church do? They covered it up. They rewrote history. They painted these unions as holy. They said these men were marrying widows. They lied about what was going on. This was nothing short of religiously sanctioned exploitation of women. The truth is, polygamy never really ended. The church still practices celestial polygamy today, sealing men to multiple wives for eternity, ensuring that the doctrine of female submission lives on in the next life. Women in the LDS Church are still treated as a means to an end, a tool for a man's exaltation. The leaders may no longer be marrying teenage girls on steamships, but make no mistake, the doctrine that allowed it has never been renounced, and it can be found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. The Mormon Church wants you to forget this history, but we won't let that happen.
If this episode shook you, you're not alone. The truth about Mormon history is painful, but also empowering. We're dedicated to exposing the dark realities that the LDS Church desperately wants to hide. And if you enjoy videos like this and want more research, you can join our Patreon, and it also helps support us in creating these episodes. And we've got tons of content on there already. We're adding more constantly, so make sure you click that link in the description to check it out. Also, like we said at the beginning of the video, if you need help with navigating a faith transition, we offer faith transition coaching to help you process the emotions, fears, and the uncertainty that comes with living in a high-demand religion. So click the link down below in the description to sign up for a faith transition coaching, no matter where you're going. If you're mainstream Christianity, Buddhist, atheist, agnostic, whatever, we are here to help you with wherever your journey leads you. And make sure to subscribe, share, and leave a comment down below. The more people who hear these stories, the more light we shine on the truth the LDS Church wants to erase. But thank you for listening to Behind the Veil, where we expose the stories and predators hiding behind the pulpits. And until next time, stay aware, stay empowered, and most importantly, stay free.